approximately 1 in 5 people suffer from an autoimmune disease. An autoimmune disease is a condition arising from an abnormal immune response to a normal body part. There are at least 80 types of autoimmune diseases. The cause is generally unknown. Some autoimmune diseases, such as lupus, run in families, and certain cases may be triggered by infection or environmental factors. Some common diseases that are generally considered autoimmune include celiac disease, diabetes type 1, Graves' disease, inflammatory bowel disease, multiple sclerosis, psoriasis, rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, and Hashimoto's. We recognize that you need some help if you are suffering from one of these autoimmune diseases. That is why we have created our therapeutic autoimmune program. The program is a 13-week program in which you'll have weekly check-in calls with your very own nutrition coach. Your nutrition coach will help you out with all things nutrition and lifestyle to help you better your symptoms. If you are suffering from an autoimmune disease, you do not have to do it alone. The team at The Chief Life are here to support you 100% of the way. You can find out more about the therapeutic autoimmune program on our website, www.thechieflife.com, and look underneath the nutrition tab. Guys, what is up? I just wanted to quickly let you know that we are now running free nutrition consults at www.thechieflife.com. You can book in for a quick 15-minute consult where we get to talk about all things nutrition, all things lifestyle with one of our fantastic nutrition coaches. So if that is something that you feel you are in need of, please jump across to www.thechieflife.com. Can't wait to see you guys booking in. Welcome to the Chief Life Podcast,
where we deliver guests and knowledge from around the world right to your ears.
Focusing on nutrition, exercise, health, and wellness.
So sit back, relax, and enjoy the show.
Guys, I'm interrupting this program to let you know that we have our optimal scorecard available at www.thechieflife.com/scorecard. This is where you can find out how you stack up on our 7 pillars. This is a little lifestyle approach that we have. So life is not just about nutrition. Getting results is not just about nutrition. There are other lifestyle factors that come into play. And this scorecard lists it out for you. You get to score where you're at compared to where you want to be. It gives you a little stepping stone to get from where you are to where you want to be. So head across to www.thechieflife.com/scorecard, and we look forward to seeing you log in your scores. The Chief Life Podcast is powered by Athena. You can head across to athena.co and gain yourselves 20 hours of free work from a virtual assistant. A virtual assistant is someone who can do any of the work that you do recurring week in, week out. For instance, for me, it was palming off the editing and the producing of the podcast. So what I've done is I've got myself a VA, Lewis, he's incredible. And each week he comes in and I send him the audio and he puts all of these new sound clips behind it. He edits it all in place. He posts it up on YouTube. He posts it to the Libsyn, which is where we host our podcast. And I pretty much don't have to do anything from here on out, which is incredible. So you too can gain access to your very own virtual assistant by going to athena.co and using the code CHIEF, all in capitals. Guys, welcome back to the Chief Life Podcast. I am Matthias Turner, joined by co-host Stacey Lee Turner.
Hey, guys.
And today we're very excited. We've got Dr. Tom Cowan on the line. Dr. Tom, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no, you're more than welcome.
So, yeah, we're super excited to have Dr. Tom on the show. He has an amazing website, fourfoldhealing.com, and he's based over in the States, running his facility out of San Francisco. And does also online consultations. Is that correct, Dr. Tom?
Not really.
Not anymore?
I mostly see people in my office 2 days a week. That's about it.
Okay, awesome. But he's released a number of amazing books, which I'm sure we'll discuss throughout the show. And I mean, a little fangirl moment for me. I was introduced to your work about a year ago, or just over a year ago. Good friends of ours in Spain recommended that I get hold of the Nourishing Traditions book of baby and child care, which you are one of the co-authors of. And it's just, blown my mind. It really helped through our conception phase and through our entire pregnancy journey. So, thank you for everything that you do.
Oh, good. Well, I'm glad it helped.
So, I mean, maybe if you could give us a little bit of a background of yourself, Dr. Tom, like how did you get into this stage of life? Like how did you get into doing the studies that you've been doing and led down this path?
Well, I mean, I had a fairly, I'd say, normal-ish upbringing. The only thing maybe of relevance there was I grew up in a family of dentists, and my parents were friends with a lot of doctors, and every once in a while I would go, when I was like 16 or so, would spend a day with one of the doctors. And I must admit, even then, I was shocked at the shallowness of their explanations.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, I didn't know what to make of it then, but it just seemed, just didn't seem very profound to me. Anyways, then I went to college and tried to do anything but be a doctor. But eventually I found myself in the Peace Corps in Swaziland teaching gardening. And I met the work of Weston Price and Rudolf Steiner.
Yeah.
And I realized at that point, this was when I was early 20s, that the kind of doctor that I didn't want to be was not the only kind of doctor there was.
Mm-hmm.
And that was sort of like an explosion inside me. And at that point, I just started learning everything I could about food and natural medicine and how things really worked. And so that's been a 40-some year journey. So by the time I went to medical school, I was already not very enamored with what I was being taught, but I knew that it would be good for my career, so to speak.
Yeah.
So I did it, and then worked a little bit as an emergency room doctor, and basically have been doing natural medicine now for about 40 years. So I've been at this for a while, and a lot of it food. I guess you could say I'm relatively food obsessed.
Mm-hmm.
I grow a lot of food. I process a lot of food. I make a lot of food. I tell people ask me what I do for a living, and I say I tell them what to eat, which seems a little weird, but
We feel you.
Yeah,
Similar
definitely.
story.
kind of what I do. And the other thing is, for whatever reason, I don't know whether it's a sort of destiny thing, I have been drawn to looking at some of the biggest questions in science, because I have a saying that I like to say, everybody now believes in science, like science is the God, the new God. And one of my favorite sayings is, the trouble with science is it's not very scientific. And so people, like, for instance, they think the heart pumps the blood around the body. I wrote a whole book sort of devoted to that.
Yeah, Human Heart, Cosmic Heart, if the listeners
Right.
want to get hold of that one.
So when you actually investigate the details of that, first of all, most doctors, most scientists have no idea where that idea came from, which is like most things.
Mhm.
It turns out some guy made it up, and the guy's name was René Descartes.
Wow.
And he was the first one who said, the heart is like a mechanical pump. Nobody believed him, and nobody thought that was true. But he said it, and then they just believe it.
It got traction later on.
Yeah, and it's so there's a lot of things like that I've looked at over the years. And so that's kind of driven me to write these books, because I think people they need to know that the world is not like we've been taught.
Yeah, definitely.
And people take it at face value, don't they? They're not taught to question it. They just take it at what they're given. Whereas there's so much more information out there coming from people like yourself.
Yeah, they just believe what they're told, even if they have no idea why.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Tom, you mentioned Weston A. Price. Can you give our listeners a bit more of an idea who he is and what he's all about? Because he's now got a foundation that you're a part of as well.
Right. So, Weston Price, there's a lot of ideas on what people should eat. Like, people should be vegans or raw foodists or keto diets or carnivores or omnivores or all kinds of things. But Price, who was a dentist, and interestingly, he was one of the founding members of the American Endodontic Society, which means he partially invented root canals, which doesn't endear him to most people, even though he actually said root canals are not very good for you, but in the beginning. And he basically got tired of, doing cavities and drilling people's teeth. So he decided to look around the world, because he'd heard that there was groups of people out there in the world who have no dental disease, which means that they live their entire lives and they never lose any teeth. They don't have crooked teeth, so they don't need orthodontists. And they never have any decay of their teeth. And that's pretty astounding, because basically every American and probably everybody in Australia has either decay or gum disease or crooked teeth or some sort of dental disease.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
We consider that normal, like that's what happens. You're born and you grow up and your teeth rot and then you die.
Mm-hmm.
And he found 14 groups scattered all over the world. One, interestingly, was in Australia. And he was able to prove that there are people who he thought, based on what they ate, have perfect health. The interesting thing about this is, if you were a gastroenterologist or a liver specialist, and you were going around the world looking for people with perfect livers, it would be hard to know who has a perfect liver and who doesn't.
Yeah.
But with teeth, it's easy. You look in their mouth, they should have 32 teeth, no decay, no orthodontic problems. And if they do, that's perfect teeth. So it's a good marker. And it's also a good marker for overall health. And a lot of these people who had been studied or were subsequently studied, they had no cancer, no heart disease, no arthritis, a lot of things. So essentially, when I heard about that, he wrote a book called Nutrition and Physical Degeneration, where he basically outlined what he found with pictures and essentially what they ate, and then how they deteriorated over the years as modern foods were introduced into their lives. So I use that as sort of my compass. In other words, if you ask yourself, are dairy products good for people? So one of the ways of answering that, you could make all kinds of theories, it's a inflammatory food or whatever. The fact of the matter is, a number of those groups of people who had the best health of anybody, they ate dairy products. That's just a fact.
Mm-hmm.
Now, part of the also the details, the devil is always in the details, and they didn't eat pasteurized, homogenized dairy products of cows eating, glyphosate sprayed,
hormone-filled, antibiotic-filled.
Yeah, and antibiotics and growth hormones and all that. They ate, only from animals that only ate grass, because that's what cows are supposed to. And the milk they drank was either raw milk, unpasteurized, full fat, or more likely they actually cultured it to make yogurt or kefir or kumis or something like that. And that's how they ate dairy products, particularly fat. So if somebody comes and says that's not good for humans, I mean, that's just doesn't square with, the history of humankind and what has actually worked. And it's the same thing for, we should all be vegans. Well, the fact of the matter is there were no people that Price found, even though he actually looked, to find a group of people who were pure vegans who had perfect teeth or perfect health. They don't exist. One of the things I sort of jokingly say is that when you eat a vegan diet, you lose reproductive capacity. So eventually they just died out. And that's fine. I mean, if that's the goal, then, more power to you. But it's not good for, having good health. Like, that should be clear.
Absolutely. And so obviously not all dairy is created equal, and now it's really hard, especially here in Australia, to come by unpasteurized, unhomogenized milk that's not full of shit. Unless you live on a dairy farm and you can drink it straight out of the cow and you know what the cow's eaten. So, I mean, what's your advice around that?
Well, my advice is to know food groups. And, I've written a lot about, there's basically 3 food groups. The first one is a food group. The first food group is animal foods, particularly full-fat animal foods.
Yeah.
The second one is seed food, which includes grains and beans and seeds and nuts.
Yep.
And the third group is vegetables with a little bit of fruit. And when you break down their diet, they all ate those 3 groups with a few minor exceptions, but basically they ate those groups. So, Native Americans, they ate buffalo and fish and rabbit and quail or whatever. And they ate pine nuts and acorns for the seed food. And they had lots of different wild and cultivated vegetables, annuals, perennials. So that's the 3 food groups. So basically the answer to your question is, if you can't find quail or turtles or insects or dairy products, then just eat one of those groups that you can find.
Yeah.
They're all the same. Eating buffalo is the same as eating, eggs or quail or wild fish. So whichever one of those, members of the group you like and you can get access to and you can afford, and you can, some people just don't like quail eggs, so fine, don't eat them. You can always find something in that group to eat. And then, you can find just one example of each group. It gets boring, but that's sort of how they ate.
Yeah. That's
So
awesome.
if you can't get dairy products, eat buffalo. And if you can't find buffalo, eat emu. And if you can't find emu, eat kangaroos or whatever. Doesn't matter.
Yeah, I love that.
Plenty of brew over here.
There is. There's a lot of kangaroos over here. Actually, to be honest, all the kangaroo that they sell in the shops isn't actually farmed kangaroo. It's just wild kangaroo that they go and cull from different land over here because they're just that much of a pest.
Yeah.
It's pretty crazy.
So maybe that's the way to go. And obviously nobody just eats the same food over and over. But so you just organize your diet around those principles, and then you sort of got it made.
Yeah, no, I love that. Can we touch a little bit on autoimmunity? What is it and why is it becoming more prevalent in the world now?
So the definition of an autoimmune disease is a person who's making more antibodies or making antibodies, which then attacks one of your own tissues and causes an inflammatory destruction of that tissue. So one of the classic examples is rheumatoid arthritis.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look in conventional medical theory, which it says for some reason, and of course they don't know because they don't know what causes anything, that your body is making too many antibodies called rheumatoid factor, and that rheumatoid factor targets and inflames the cartilage and causes damage. And if it's Hashimoto's, it's the same, except it's thyroid antibodies. And if it's lupus, it's the same. except it's antibodies against your skin and kidneys and on and on. So the real question is, what causes people to start making too many antibodies? And you would think that would be the only question that people would be trying to answer, because that's the whole, shebang. That's the only relevant question.
Yeah.
But the fact of the matter is they don't study that. They study, how can we stop you from making antibodies? So they do. They develop all kind of medicines and strategies to make you stop making antibodies. And of course, there's two problems with that. One is they don't know how to target just that antibody, so they stop you from making all antibodies, which that means you have a problem, like lymphoma and stuff. So that's one problem. But the other problem is you don't make antibodies because you have a stupid body. You make antibodies because you're exposed to something that's stimulating you to make antibodies. It's the analogy I tell patients is, it's like you get a splinter in your finger and then you make pus. The pus is the therapy for the splinter. And the reason I know that is because if you make a mistake and say, oh, the pus is the disease, you get rid of the pus with like an antibiotic, and it'll just happen over and over again, because the pus is the therapy, the splinter is the disease.
Yeah, it's the body trying to heal itself.
Yeah, the antibodies are the therapy. Now, they also cause damage, just like pus causes damage. But that doesn't mean they're still the body's attempt to neutralize something. So what's the antigen? In other words, what's the splinter? So I wrote a whole book on this, and the title was Vaccines, Autoimmunity, and the Changing Nature of Childhood Disease. So again, the problem is we make too many antibodies.
Yeah.
So when you get into studying this, you find that we don't have an immune system. We have two immune systems that work together. The first is called the cell-mediated, and the second is called the humoral or antibody arm. And the way it works is, if you get a viral infection like chickenpox, so you get infected with chickenpox, it gets into your tissues, you get millions of cells that have this virus in it. Your body uses the white blood cells to essentially digest and excrete the infected cells. And that takes about 7 to 10 days. During that time, you're what we call sick, meaning you have a rash and fever and mucus and a cough and all the rest of it. And that being sick is your body's way of clearing out the virally infected dysfunctional cells. That should be very clear.
Yeah.
The point I'm making here is, what we call sick is not because of the virus, it's because of the cell-mediated reaction to the virus. There's a difference. The reason I know that is because you can infect somebody with a virus and then suppress their cell-mediated immune system with prednisone or something, and they will not get sick. They could die, but they won't get sick. You can also stimulate their cell-mediated immune system with chemicals. You don't need an infection, and the person will be sick. In other words, being sick is a function of your cell-mediated immune system.
Yeah.
So that goes on for 7 or 10 days, and then comes the second part of the immune system. Then you make antibodies to remember what happened, so that if you ever encounter the chickenpox again, you've made antibodies coded to a certain part of that virus. You neutralize the virus before it infects the cells. You never need to get your cell-mediated reaction involved again, and you're not sick. So that humoral or antibody arm has no symptoms. You don't know anything's happening. It takes 6 weeks or so. And now you've made antibodies, and when you have both of those working together, you are immune for life against chickenpox or measles or whatever it is.
Yeah, and so that will happen if you get chickenpox as an actual disease or actual infection, and you work your way through it naturally yourself. And both us as children had chickenpox, and we weren't. I don't think we had vaccines for it. And
Right.
so now we're protected against it. What's the
Yes.
difference between us having chickenpox and naturally creating that defense versus if a child is vaccinated against chickenpox?
Right. So the whole point of the vaccine program is we don't want the cell-mediated part because that's making you sick.
In
And
inverted
if you
commas.
kept giving people vaccines and they got a cell-mediated reaction, their parents would say, "Hey, you just made my child sick, and I don't want to do that."
Mm.
So they're engineered by putting things in there to stimulate a antibody reaction with no prior cell-mediated reaction first. Now, I would just point out that's the first time, I think, in human history that happens like that.
Mhm.
It always happens first cell-mediated, then antibodies. So the vaccine theory circumvents that, and they put usually aluminum in there. And the reason they put it in there is because if they just inject you with chickenpox antigen, you wouldn't make any antibodies. So they have to inject you with an adjuvant, which makes you make antibodies.
Mm.
So in other words, you could say that vaccine theory is a strategy to make people make antibodies, right? That's the whole point.
Yeah.
Now, some of the antibodies are against whatever, the chickenpox, but some of them are not to the chickenpox, could be to anything. So then you do that repeatedly. In the US, they do it about 69 times before you're 16. And then some of those people in the US, it's about 54% of them develop a condition essentially called too many antibodies. That's an autoimmune disease.
Yeah.
So the question is, how did they get too many antibodies? Well, that was the whole point of the vaccine program. It worked.
Yeah.
Too well.
Everybody got medicine, so to speak, to make them make antibodies. So they did, and now they have the disease called too many antibodies destroying my body disease.
Yeah, and
Wow.
they attack their own bodies.
And they wonder, why did this happen?
Yeah.
I mean, I think to myself, I mean, what do you think is going to happen if you inject medicines, toxins really,
Mm.
to make you make antibodies? The likelihood is you will,
Yeah.
because that's the whole point. That's why they put them in there.
Yeah. There's
And
actually
if you make too many antibodies, that's an autoimmune disease.
Absolutely. Tom, there's actually something I've heard you say on a previous podcast where you're saying about, when people get sick, they say, "Oh, and now I'm better." And if they go through the natural illness and they say, "Oh, now I'm better," it's a literal, like, I'm better because they've actually now naturally created the antibodies to defend themselves from that sickness in future. And I really like that.
Yeah, and they do it in that two-step process. And
Mm-hmm.
the interesting thing about this is we have very clear, definitive research showing that children who go through, what used to be called the traditional childhood diseases, chickenpox, measles, mumps, German measles, all those,
Yeah.
pertussis, have less cancer, brain cancer, heart disease, osteoarthritis, chronic illness of all sorts later in life. There is no doubt of that.
Do you know how big that study pool is?
I mean, if you go to a guy named Neil Miller, wrote a book called 400 peer-reviewed studies of vaccines.
Mm-hmm.
There's approximately 20 of those studies are exactly what I just said.
Yeah. Okay. Cool.
That's awesome. And
There's no doubt of this. Everybody who has taken the chance to review the literature, and it also correlates with what traditional people have said for hundreds of years. 2,500 years ago, Hippocrates said, "Give me a medicine to produce a fever and I can cure any disease."
Mm.
Yeah.
In other words, the cell-mediated reaction, is like the pus getting rid of the splinter. And now we have, 250 million people walking around with splinters in their body.
And no pus. And I mean, one of the things that you talk about a lot in your newest book, The Vaccines, Autoimmunity, and the Changing Nature of Childhood Illnesses, that you did publish last year, is that a lot of people are saying that this epidemic of autoimmune issues is due to more awareness around it, and they're ignoring the fact that it's actually causal.
Right. That's like they say that about autism. They say that the newest baloney about autism is, we've always had autistic people. We just didn't know how to diagnose it. So here's what I would say to that. So if you've ever had a chance to spend time with autistic people, like I have for years, I've been part of Camp Hill communities and I spent summer camps working with autistic children and, been a doctor for autistic people. When you see somebody who's genuinely, autistic, and they're spending their day, twizzling grass and spinning tops and saying the same thing over and over again. So you mean to tell me that the average person in 1930 wouldn't have said to themselves, "Hey, what's the matter with that guy? He's 20 and he can't talk and he's pooping in his pants and he's spinning tops all day long. I think there's something wrong with him." So apparently they weren't smart enough to see that. Now, the other thing, I sometimes say, I imagine Thomas Jefferson and George Washington say, because apparently there was just as many autistic children then. So they must have missed it because they never mentioned it. And the other thing is something like 80% of autistic people end up living in institutions. I don't know about you, but I know of very few 60-year-old, autistic people in institutions. And now, one out of, I don't know what it is, 37 or so boys in this country are diagnosed with autism.
Wow.
That's not better diagnosis. That's the biggest bunch of hooey I've ever heard in my life.
Yeah, it's become a lot more prevalent.
Anybody who says that, I can only imagine, has never actually seen an autistic person.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
Could you touch on herd immunity? It's definitely something that people who are very strong on the vaccination side would fall back to and say, well, herd immunity is something that's a reason why we all have to be immunized, or why we don't have to be immunized. Can you touch on what herd immunity is and I guess how it falls into place? Yeah,
I would also just urge you to stop using the word immunization and use the word vaccination.
Okay, yeah.
Immunization implies that you're acquiring effective immunity, which you're not.
Yeah.
And vaccination is actually what the process is.
Yeah.
So it may be semantics, but so let's take the biggest bugaboo, which is measles. So according to the CDC, they say we have to have 95% plus of the people in the population immune to measles in order to have this so-called herd immunity, which means there's a sufficient low number of people in the population so it essentially stops the transmission.
Yeah.
So the goal is 95% of the people immune. Now, if you also read the CDC, they have published many studies and other, peer-reviewed studies on the failure rate of the measles vaccine. And measles vaccine has two different kinds of failure rate. The first kind is called primary failure, which means a certain percentage of people, no matter what you put in the vaccine, will not acquire antibodies to the vaccine. And the range is between 4 and 8%. So let's say it's 6%. That's the middle.
Yeah.
That means if you vaccinated 100% of the population, you would at best get 94% of the people immune, which is less than 95%. So that means you can't get herd immunity through a vaccine. But there's another kind of failure rate, which is called the secondary failure rate. Secondary failure rate means the person does develop antibodies, but over time the antibodies wane and then they become susceptible again.
Yeah.
Now, they told us in the beginning that one measles shot would last for life because it was just the same as the illness.
Mm-hmm.
But then they found out that there is this secondary failure rate, and so now everybody gets 2 shots because the antibody levels, which supposedly mean you're immune, they deteriorate over time. According to the CDC's published data, the secondary failure rate, in other words, the number of people, the percentage of people who will stop being immune, is between 0.5% to 1% per year.
Wow.
So let's give them the benefit of the doubt and say it's the lower number, 0.5%. So that means if you get your measles shot when you're 10, and now you're 40, so that's 30 years, so 0.5% per year. That means at best, 15% of those people will not have immunity to measles.
Mm-hmm.
If you're 60, that means somewhere between 30 and 60%. And if you do complicated math and do an algorithm and do some calculus, that means approximately 18% of the people, because of secondary failure, will not be immune to measles. So if you add the 6%, which is the primary failure, and the 18%, which is the secondary failure, and by the way, these are the CDC's, which is the Center for Disease Control. They're actually a semi-private corporation that makes its money selling vaccines, but we think they're a government organization, but they're not. But so these are from their own data. The highest percentage you can get from the vaccine is 76%, which is 20% lower than what they say you need for herd immunity. Therefore, the medical literature is absolutely clear, no argument about this, that you can never either eradicate measles, which you shouldn't do anyways, but even if you wanted to, you couldn't, and you will never get herd immunity through vaccination. It simply isn't possible. They know that. They write articles about how they're can they engineer the vaccine any better? Can they give it, some people have said, they have to give it to 20-year-olds and then 30-year-olds. And the trouble is that the more times you give the measles vaccine, the higher the side effects. Adults don't tolerate it. And if you give a 30-year-old a measles vaccine, it only lasts for about a year. And so then the secondary failure rate gets even higher. The whole thing is it's just a nightmare.
Yeah.
And they know it. And that's one of the reasons they're so determined to get on top of this. It's the old, if you want to create a narrative, you have to be the first one in. So they're the first one in, and so that they can blame. They know that there's going to be measles more and more in older people, and they have to blame it on somebody, and they don't want to blame it on the vaccine as a failure, which they already know it is. So they blame it on people who are unvaccinated.
Yeah.
I would say I can only give them credit. It's a very clever strategy.
Yeah, it's very fear-based propaganda, hey?
Yeah, it's very clever. They're good at it. And, and it takes, I must say, it takes a lot of effort to dissect this. I've spent hundreds of hours reading CDC reports and conferences and you name it to actually figure out what the real story is. So I know I don't expect people to do it. That's why I wrote this book.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, there's a lot of information in that book. And then also, even in chapter 6, you've got in the Nourishing Traditions book, talks a lot about vaccinations. And there's a section on what you just explained about herd immunity. So, if people are hearing this and they want like physical documentation to be able to share with those or to research it deeper, get your hands on a copy of these books, because then you've got that tangible kind of evidence to show people, when you're trying to, it's a very passionate and controversial topic. But I mean, from what you're telling us and what I've read in your books, it's, herd immunity is a fallacy. And I seem to feel like it sends people into this false sense of security of, oh, well, I'm vaccinated, it's fine. And they just assume that they will never get the disease because they've had a vaccine. And across the board, maybe not just for measles, but across the board, I think people think, oh, I get, the flu shot and then I never get sick. And it's like, no, that is not a thing. That doesn't actually work like that.
No, the studies on the flu shots absolutely are very clear that people who get flu shots have a higher incidence of disease, especially respiratory disease, than people who don't. Mm-hmm. There's no doubt of that. These are published in peer-reviewed journals, very clear science and evidence, and like the pertussis it's a toxin, the vaccine. It doesn't confer any benefit for transmitting the disease. None. And that's not in dispute. They know it doesn't. So this idea that, I've heard the campaigns, you have to do it not for yourself, but for poor Aunt Bessie who's in a nursing home and may die, it has no effect on that. Mm. So it's a complete myth that is very clear, even from the CDC's own published research. Why they say otherwise, I mean, I don't know. I guess you have to ask them.
Yeah, it's a big topic, hey?
We know a lady who actually got the flu shot a few years ago, and now she has, after that event, is now suffering from a neurological disease. And she has a seizure every single day.
And tremors, and lots of horror.
I mean, when you put two of the most potent neurotoxins on the planet, meaning aluminum and mercury, and you repeatedly inject it into a human being, presumably who has nerves, I don't know what people expect is going to happen. Yeah. Except you're going to damage the nerves of a certain percentage of the people. And why some people and not others is probably complicated, but, I don't know.
It affects everybody differently, right? So some people, like our friend, will get a neurological disorder, unfortunately, and then other people, it will affect them in the autoimmune way that maybe isn't impacting their life as strongly as our poor friend who's suffering with a neurological disorder, but it's still affecting their quality of life and their long-term health outcome. So it's just a slower degeneration, right. I guess.
Yeah, I mean, in my view, it affects everybody. You can't inject a biological entity, a human being, with those kind of things and get off scot-free.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
So, I mean, speaking about pregnant mothers and they go through the system here in Australia, and it's probably similar in the States, they are recommended to get flu shot and whooping cough. And if you refuse it, you get made to feel like you're a bad parent by certain health practitioners. How can you empower parents to, I guess, stand up for themselves in these situations?
Yeah.
I mean, it's hard, but the only answer to that is they just have to know the facts.
Yeah, educate themselves.
I mean, that's again why I wrote the book. It's not the only book, but I mean, my intention was to make it, not fun. I don't know if it's fun. Let's say fun-ish.
Yeah.
To read, and you can understand the situation, and then you can get into more facts if you want. I mean, people just have to realize that the doctors or the people who are saying that actually are very little educated in this. They know basically nothing. And when I think back to my own medical education, we didn't have one single class in how vaccines work or what's in them or how they got started or any toxic effects of vaccines or adverse effects. Not one lecture, not one class. It's here's the schedule, do it.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, I mean, that's, they don't, so, how, you know, what do you say to a parent? I mean, it's a tough world out there these days. And this is one of the toughest problems. I don't envy parents at all. I mean, when I was, you know, early days of my practice, I was in a small town in New Hampshire. It was, you know, we were with a Waldorf school and a biodynamic farm, and my medical practice, my patients were my friends with their children. I had children. I didn't vaccinate anybody. Nobody had any vaccines. We didn't use antibiotics, and nobody thought about it.
Yeah.
I mean, it just wasn't an issue for us.
Mm.
And so it was easy. You know, nobody showed any things at school. Nobody had cards and all that stuff. Now it's a nightmare.
Yeah.
In California, it's a real nightmare.
Mm.
And I feel bad for parents, but I can only say that, you know, start with my book or some of the other books that are written out there. Go to Children's Health Defense, you know, Bobby Kennedy, Robert Kennedy Jr. is his official name. He knows more about this subject than probably anybody alive.
Yeah, and actually he's quite vocal on Instagram. So for those of you listeners that are on social media, definitely check out his Instagram page.
Yeah, I mean, he's a real warrior on this. And somehow it must have pissed him off. I mean, I've met him, so I know a little bit of his story. Mm-hmm. But you know, he's maybe the best hope for changing the picture here, but he's got a really tough road to go here.
Yeah.
So I feel very bad for parents. I most of the time don't know what to tell them except educate yourself and just try to avoid the system as much as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess that's what I want to kind of leave people with today is where they can find this information. You know, your books are amazing. And I've got the Nourishing Traditions book in front of me now. On page 116, it's got a list of all the toxic additives that are in vaccines. So just when you look at that list, it's like, I don't know, there's probably like 40 or 50 things there.
Yeah.
And just once people see that, they're less likely to take at face value. Like, you know, you don't eat food that you don't know what ingredients are in it. Why would you be injected with a needle that you don't know what ingredients are in that substance? So that kind of is my question to people.
I have a good friend whose name is Stephanie Seneff, and I think she's one of the directors of the MIT, which is, you know, one of the most prestigious universities in the world.
Yeah.
Artificial Intelligence Center or Lab. So she's a high up, you know, researcher in American science. And she is very strongly, I would say, anti-vaccine. And one of the things she's particularly interested in glyphosate and knows everything you need to know about glyphosate, or I don't know if anybody needs to know anything about it, but it's the thing they need to know about it is it's not good for you.
Yeah.
It turns out glyphosate is in the measles vaccine.
What?
There you go. Because
how
we
do
talk
I
about it
know
a
that?
lot on our podcast with
Yeah,
food.
Stephanie found it in there.
Oh, wow.
So there's no doubt. I mean, Stephanie's one of the most conscientious researchers probably alive. And she knows how it got in there and everything. So, I mean, if you don't mind injecting your 15-month-old child with glyphosate, which I don't know that anybody would do that.
Yeah. Once they know, right? Once you've educated yourself and you know what's going on, why would you do that to your most precious gift?
Yeah, it's pretty hefty. And I think like the crazy thing is that we are told to get all of these vaccinations from birth, like starting with your vitamin K and your Hep B before you even leave the hospital with your kid. At least that's the protocol here in Australia. I don't know about what it is over in America.
And you can say no here. It's not compulsory, but again, to say no, you need to be educated and empowered. So
yeah, but I guess is there ever a stage that if you were to vaccinate that it would be a better stage to do it rather than when the kid has just come straight out of the womb?
Yeah, when you're 120, then it's okay. You can start then.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, they throw all these things at you about, like, if there's trauma during the birth, you need vitamin K to be injected to help with, you know, the coagulation of blood and all that sort of thing.
I mean, that's not a vaccine. That's
No.
that's a medicine.
Supplement.
But
Yeah.
I mean,
Like, I guess our question is, what are the alternatives? So you spoke about vaccination being very different from immunization, and we love the natural, well, I guess I can't talk for both of us, but I definitely love natural medicine and alternative options. So, you know, is there homeopathy routes that people can use for immunization, or should they literally just choose to
Grow
just
up in
let
life,
life evolve and see what happens?
yeah, I mean, you know, the fact of the matter is, and again, this is CDC data, when you look at the death rate from measles as taking one example, but they're all the same, more or less.
Mm-hmm.
The maximum death rate was in around 1920, where there was about 100 per 100,000 children. And then in 1962, the death rate was 3 per 100,000. And then the 1963 was when the vaccine was introduced. So and then since 1963, the death rate has basically been the same. So it didn't change the death rate because the death rate was basically zero before the vaccine was introduced.
Mm.
And that's the most important thing that people should remember, is that this was an extremely low risk situation that actually strengthened you for life. Now, I'm fully aware that bad things can happen to people, you know, of all sorts. And so one doesn't want to say, well, nothing bad could ever happen to you. But the fact of the matter is, bad things can happen from a lot of different points of view. And if you vaccinate, you're ensuring that at least some bad things will happen to you.
It's like a guarantee.
Yeah. If you don't, you know, I mean, in all my years as a family doctor, I never saw a bad outcome from any of these childhood diseases. I'm sure it could happen. I don't want to jinx myself, but you know, it's mostly fear and so what do I tell people? I tell people, you know, eat good food, get out in the sun, have a nice life with people that you enjoy being with, you know, play in the dirt, go swimming in the ocean, don't use electronic devices, and avoid school as much as possible.
That sounds like an amazing life to live by.
Grow your own food.
Yeah, that's awesome.
So if you do that, you have very little to worry about.
And that's the thing, you've got to consider those other health and lifestyle factors. You can't just keep eating the shit and not paying attention to your health in general, hey?
Right, except it turns out in 1962, when there was basically no deaths from measles, people had a horrible diet, and they still didn't die from measles. So
I guess now, because we've got all these autoimmune...
say to a person, you better eat a good diet or you're going to die from measles, because that's just not true.
It's not true. But I guess now that we have had all
Americans ate a horrible diet. I mean, I grew up in the early 60s. We ate Twinkies and, you know, and frozen vegetables.
Yeah.
And I still didn't die from measles.
But I guess now that everybody has been vaccinated through these programs and they do have these autoimmune issues, it probably is more important for them to pay attention to these things because they're now fighting these autoimmune issues.
If you're sick, you better do something different.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
okay.
I'm not saying we should go back and eat Twinkies, but, you know, I'm all for eating the, you know, Nourishing Traditions Weston Price way, but I wouldn't tell somebody you have to do this or you're going to have a bad outcome from measles, because that's not.
Yeah, totally. And so if parents are choosing not to vaccinate their newborn, are there considerations that need to go into place? For example, if somebody has decided to go and get a whooping cough vaccine because they're like, oh, I'm going to see this newborn baby. They have an active virus in their body. Is there a period of time that they should not come and see that newborn baby who has not been vaccinated? Because otherwise, are they putting that baby at risk?
Maybe. The risk is far greater from vaccinated people infecting the rest of us than unvaccinating people. I mean, it's one of the biggest ironies of this whole thing is these people who get vaccinated, they say that it works perfectly well. So what are they so worried about from the unvaccinated?
Yeah.
I mean, the worst thing that can happen is somebody else's child, dies of measles. My child is fine because they got vaccinated. And it's just one of the ironies of this whole craziness. But yes, there is some risk of, particularly whooping cough, the pertussis. You can actually infect other people. At least we think so. So,
is it 90 days? I've heard or read somewhere.
All vaccinated people, put them in a big pen. I'm actually kidding. So don't. I don't want anybody to quote me on that one.
No. But so, I mean, if, for example, if parents decide not to vaccinate their child and then the family want to come and see the child, and without communication, the family members go and for some reason get the whooping cough vaccine, should they wait a period of time before coming to visit the unvaccinated baby?
They should check into a psychiatric hospital first. And then they get discharged, they can visit the baby.
Okay, sounds good.
We don't really know. So,
right.
I don't know.
It's hard to say.
I think I read somewhere around 90 days or 3 months.
But it's hard to know those things because they don't really study them enough so that you could make a great answer.
Yeah, okay, fair enough. So just proceed with caution if that's your situation.
Yeah, right.
Okay.
Unreal. Well, I think that's probably a good place to wrap.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
That's a lot of information.
There's
Thank you.
a lot of really good information there, Dr. Tom. So thank you very much for your time. Where can people, of all of your books, where is the best place for them to buy it from? Is it from your website or Amazon or anything like that?
Anywhere is fine. Amazon is fine. I have that website, which is going to be drtomcowan.com. Mm-hmm. There's the fourfoldhealing.com. There's also Dr. Cowan's Garden, DRCOWANS garden.com. And then there's humanheartcosmicheart.com.
Wow.
Okay,
They're going to all be in one website someday, but not for a while.
That's great. Final question. What do you think the greatest thing is for a successful garden?
That's a good question. Intention and care. Mm-hmm. So you just have to be there and observe and just try to feel what the plants are needing, and then just try to work with it. And the more you do it, the better you get at it.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I love it.
Look after those life beings.
Yeah, we started growing and we've had our first harvest earlier in the year, and we're just about due for our next harvest, which is exciting. It's really actually quite an empowering thing, living off of your own food. Yeah,
right. I'm a very avid gardener, and it's a big part of my life because it connects you with reality in a way that I don't know of many other things that do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. All right. Well, I think that's a good place to wrap. Thank you so much, Dr. Tom. That was great.
Yeah, thank you so much for your time.
Okay, thank you. Amazing. Good luck.
Cheers.
Visit thechieflife.com for all of your nutrition coaching needs, your own personalized meal plan, as well as how you can get involved with one of our 7-pillar retreats.